In October 2013, the U.S. Navy signed a contract to get rid of a warship that had cost $217 million to build. The winning bid was 1 cent. The ship was the USS Forrestal, named for James Forrestal, the first U.S. Secretary of Defense. The Navy ordered her on July 12, 1951, in the early, anxious years of the Cold War, when Congress was pouring money into naval aviation to make sure the Soviet Union never doubted American reach. Newport News Shipbuilding laid her keel a year later on July 14, 1952. When she launched on December 11, 1954, Popular Science called her the biggest ship ever built. More than 16,000 engineers, draftsmen, and builders had worked on her. She was commissioned on September 29, 1955, the first of a new category the Navy would call Supercarriers, the first American flat top built from the keel up with an angled flight deck, an optical landing system, and steam catapults, features that became the standard template for every carrier the Navy built afterward. Her air conditioning system alone, according to contemporary reporting, could have cooled the Empire State Building 2.5 times over. She displaced more than 60,000 tons standard, over 81,000 tons at full load, and carried roughly 5,000 sailors and aircrew when her air wing was aboard. She cost $217 million to build in 1955 dollars, close to $2 billion today. The Forrestal wasn't a one-off. She was the first of 4 nearly identical sister ships, each ordered within a few years of the others, each carrying a price tag in the same range. The Saratoga at $209.7 million, the Ranger at $182 million, the Independence at $182.3 million. Together, the 4 ships cost the country roughly $790 million in the 1950s, several billion dollars in today's money, built to project American naval power through the tensest years of the Cold War. Nobody budgeted. At the moment, any of them were ordered for what it would eventually cost to get rid of them, or what they'd be worth by the time that day came. The Forrestal earned her place in history less for what she cost than for what happened aboard her on July 29, 1967. In the Gulf of Tonkin, stray electrical current triggered a Zuni rocket to fire off an aircraft parked on her flight deck, packed at the time with fully fueled and armed planes ready for the day's strikes against North Vietnam. The rocket struck a fuel tank on an armed A-4 Skyhawk piloted by a young Navy lieutenant commander named John S. McCain III. The resulting fire and chain of explosions burned for most of a day, killed 134 sailors, wounded 161 more, and destroyed 21 aircraft. McCain survived. He went on to become a prisoner of war in Vietnam, then a United States Senator and a presidential nominee, a piece of the Forrestal story that outlived the ship itself by decades. The Navy repaired the damage and kept her in service for another quarter century. The Navy decommissioned the Forrestal on September 11, 1993, after more than 38 years of service, and struck her from the Naval Vessel Register the same day. What followed was not a quick disposal. The Navy offered her up as a potential museum ship, the way other retired carriers had occasionally found second lives tied up as floating exhibits. And for years, 2 separate volunteer efforts tried to make that happen. A group in Tampa, Florida, formally proposed turning her into a sea, air, and space museum on the city's Ybor Channel in May 1999, the only application the Navy had on file as its deadline approached. A rival group in Baltimore made its own pitch that November, at literally the last moment before the window closed. Tampa's plan collapsed first, in January 2002, after the group lost its proposed site and ran out of money to find another one. Baltimore's group held on 4 years longer, announcing in December 2006 that it couldn't line up the sponsorship it needed either, converting a 1,067-foot, 81,000-ton warship into a self-sustaining museum turned out to be a far more expensive undertaking than either city's backers could actually finance. No other serious bid ever materialized. While those efforts failed, the ship simply sat, first at Naval Station Newport in Rhode Island for more than 15 years. Then, starting with a 3-day tow in June 2010 at the Navy's inactive ship facility in Philadelphia, keeping a decommissioned supercarrier structurally sound and out of the harbor floor for the better part of 2 decades isn't free. Someone has to maintain the hull, run the mooring lines, pump the bilges, and keep the basic systems working. That stops 60,000 plus tons of steel from becoming a hazard at the dock. That maintenance came out of the Navy's own inactive ships budget, year after year, for a vessel doing nothing but waiting for someone, a museum sponsor, a scrap buyer, anyone, to decide what happened to it next. It was money added on top of the $217 million already spent building her and the decades of fuel, munitions, and payroll that came with 38 years of active service. None of it recoverable, all of it simply gone by the time a buyer finally showed up offering a single cent. By October 2013, the Navy had given up on finding anyone who wanted the Forrestal for anything other than her raw materials. It solicited competitive bids for what the contract itself called the towing, dismantling, and recycling of the ship. Structured as an indefinite delivery contract, the Navy intended to use again for the sister carriers still waiting in line behind her. It awarded the job to All-Star Metals of Brownsville, Texas. The winning bid, 1 cent, was not a mistake or a rounding error. It was a calculated number. The company had worked out what it could earn selling off the ship's steel, aluminum, and wiring once the hull was cut apart, and priced the entire removal job accordingly, low enough to guarantee it beat every other bidder for the contract while still walking away with a profit. All-Star Metals' own president, Nikhil Shah, told a reporter the eventual profit would run into the millions without naming a figure, and called the Forrestal the largest ship his company or the U.S. government had ever handled for dismantling. All-Star hired Foss Marine Towing to haul the ship south. The tow left the Philadelphia dock at 5:31 in the morning on February 4th, 2014, carrying 1,067 feet of steel down the eastern seaboard and across the Gulf of Mexico to Brownsville, a trip of roughly 17 days. Scrapping work continued until the ship was fully gone by December 2015. Nobody who built or bought the Forrestal ever answered for the gap between what she cost and what she was worth at the end. The Navy wasn't defrauded. The 1 cent bid was exactly how government surplus contracts are supposed to work when an asset's dismantling costs exceed its scrap value, or in this case, when a scrapper is confident enough in the recovered metal to take the job essentially for free. But nobody in the Pentagon's shipbuilding budgets of the early 1950s appears to have planned for this outcome either, and nobody was made to explain publicly why a warship that cost the equivalent of nearly $2 billion ended its life valued at less than the change in a sailor's pocket. The same pattern simply repeated for her sister ships. The Saratoga went to a Brownsville scrapper for a penny in 2014. The Kitty Hawk and the John F. Kennedy followed for a penny each in 2021, closing out the entire era of conventionally powered American supercarriers the same way it began, with the Forrestal sold for 1 cent at the front of the line. The Forrestal is gone now, fully recycled into raw steel and aluminum somewhere in the supply chain, its air conditioning ducts and gun mounts broken down into commodities with no memory of what they used to cool or defend. The country spent $217 million building the first supercarrier, and 38 years, 1 catastrophic fire, and 2 decades of failed museum bids later paid a Texas scrap company essentially nothing to make her disappear. Every other ship in her class followed the same path to the same kind of buyer, for the same symbolic price, until The entire generation of conventionally powered American supercarriers had been converted, one penny at a time, into scrap metal. The only entity that ever calculated with real precision exactly what the Forrestal was worth was the company that turned her into scrap.